I am the advisor, Professor Ladone. If you are interested in any of the events that we have coming up this semester, or you want to learn more about the club, come see me, come to one of our meetings. We'd love to have you. And so we're joined by Professor Applewhite and Professor Borck, who are going to be sharing with us some of their responses, ideas, feelings about the book. I have some questions prepared for after the live stream, but I thought that we would start with this very short clip of James Baldwin, this is a clip where he talks about despair. He has a lot more hope than Ta-Nehisi Coates does in his book. And I'm not sure if any of you have read the book, but I thought that this was kind of a good starting piece, and I want to see, or I want to show what he says about hope and despair. And then I'm going to ask Professor Applewhite and Professor Borck to kind of comment on this idea. Make sure I'm following this up.
A certain power that I have had to deal with, which stuck with me, which is called love. And love comes in very strange packages. I love a few men, I love a few women. And a few people love me. That's, I suppose, is all that saved my life.
Black people live in this hostile world, which thinks everything is white.
Are you still in despair about the world?
And I've been in despair about the world. I'm in rage.
Enraged, all right.
I don't think I'm in despair. I can't afford despair. I can't tell my nephew, my niece, you can't tell them, you can't tell the children. There's no hope.
So, Baldwin has a lot more hope than Coates does in his work, in his book. And so I want to kind of start with your kind of impressions of this conversation of hope versus despair. Is there a place for both? Where do you see Coates' work fitting into this conversation on hope versus despair? If you can kind of comment that, situate that with Baldwin's comments.
Sure.
Either of you?
So hi, I'm Professor Applewhite, and it's very.
Should we go sit like up the
You
beach?
did,
Yeah,
yeah,
maybe.
you all can sit here too.
Sure. You gotta forgive me because I've been teaching all day, so it's been a really long day. We're actually recording this discussion, but so it's funny because I actually watched this clip literally about 45 minutes ago.
Really?
Yeah, because I was just sort of reading up. I listened to the book, the Coates book. I didn't actually read it, and so I was just sort of reading different reviews and stuff just to get my thoughts together about the book. And what I would say is, I think Baldwin's perspective and his ideas around hope and love, which is the other thing he actually talked about, are different from Coates because they are different generationally, right? So the things that they the way they experience white supremacy, because that's what he's essentially talking about, is from a generational perspective. You have to, I think you should understand there's some historical context with Baldwin. Baldwin comes from a place where, he grew up in a black community. He's also a gay man. He's dealt with multiple forms of oppression or marginalization. And so, despite all of those things, and it's something about his generation as well, right? Like these sort of people who came of age in the 50s and 60s, where they do hold on to this idea of like the dream, which we'll talk about, and which Coates will talk about, that they were, although they were denied opportunities, there was a strong belief that was sort of provided to them by the black community and the black church that you should be grounded in hope and in love. And so Baldwin's grounding is really coming from growing up in the black community, but also growing up in the black church, which Coates, if you know from the book, he actually is, he's not religious, right? He is agnostic, atheist. And so that hope that we get, that Black folks, and I'm talking in generalizations of course, but as a community, the hope that many of us got from growing up in the church, right, where we know that white supremacy exists and it sort of permeates in all the various social institutions, right? Baldwin got that from the church and he got that from the Black community, whereas Coates grows up in a different era. Coates and I are very similar in age. I think he's 40, 41, I'm 43. I grew up in Baltimore. A part of my life, I was born in Baltimore. He grew up in Baltimore after I left. I left Baltimore in '85. He was coming of age in Baltimore at a time when I left. So the despair that he sees and that's very present for him of the Baltimore that he lived in, right? I don't really know of that Baltimore because I left before the era of crack and all this really bad things that decimated Baltimore. And so the despair he speaks of, it comes from a religious place, because he didn't grow up in a Black church. And it also comes from seeing his city sort of being torn apart. And seeing these it also is an aftermath of being like a generation after the Civil Rights Movement, where we had all these hopes for the country and for people, and about racism and white supremacy, and seeing that sort of hope dashed or destroyed. So I think there is room for both. I think you have to look at it from a historical perspective, and you have to know the stories and lives of Black folks. He has a right to, there is something to despair. Let's not minimize what there is to despair about. Black men, Black people, people of color their bodies are being broken and destroyed. And that's despairing to me. I can have hope and I can have love, and that can be despairing to me. That can break us down. So for me, I think that I think he's writing from the despair also of a parent, right? His perspective is slightly different, right? Because he has a child, he has a Black boy who looks just like him, that he has to help navigate this world, this racist, white supremacist world. And so there's a despair in that. There's a fear that he talks about in the book that we'll talk about later.
Okay, so for folks that haven't read Baldwin or don't know why we're comparing Coates to Baldwin, James Baldwin wrote a book called The Fire Next Time, which is a letter to his nephew, who is a young Black boy, and Coates' book is a letter to his son, who's a young Black boy. So Coates definitely takes the kind of format of his writing from Baldwin in this way. They're both kind of Black men offering a narrative about the way that race works in the United States to these young Black boys who are coming up in this country. I think that for me, so I went and reread, well actually it's funny, I listened to The Fire Next Time and I read Between the World and Me, but after reading Between the World and Me and sort of seeing media show up about comparing Coates to Baldwin, I went back and listened to The Fire Next Time, and I agree with all of Sheldon's comments. To me, what struck me is that I think The Fire Next Time reads as much more of like a political inspiration, if not almost like agenda. It's much more righteous, it's much more in your face. I feel like Coates, Between the World and Me, feels much more like a meditation on white supremacist violence against Black bodies. It really does, unlike The Fire Next Time, which I think stops feeling like a letter to his nephew pretty quickly, Between the World and Me feels consistently like a letter to his son throughout the whole thing. It's almost like, it feels like this like special gift or like secret that you get to be a part of as a reader, because he's constantly addressing his son throughout the piece, and so it's almost like his project to me doesn't feel like he's imagining a wide readership or a wide audience, at the same time that it's like a performance of intimacy almost to me. So do you think, so Stephanie sent us some questions ahead of time, and I'm not as like off the cuff articulate as Sheldon is, so I like just prepared some things to say.
I just look off the cuff. articulate.
I think he's good at it. So do you think that we have time for me to like?
Well, yeah, but can I ask you kind of a follow-up question?
Sure.
Right? Because so some of the reviews of the book have been and Tressie
Macmillan Cotton.
yeah, I just read this actually yesterday. She actually sort of saw this book as two texts in one. One, a letter to his son, sort of this deeply personal kind of intimate gift, but one also a letter to white America. Did you read that from the book, or was that your rendering of the book, or no? Either.
See where you.
I don't feel like it's a letter to white America. But it's obviously, I mean, I kind of liked, I didn't imagine it as a letter to white people, and I kind of liked that. Like, I liked that that's not his project.
Yeah.
And I feel like and Tressie Macmillan Cotton also says, like, to the people who want Coates to be addressing white people more explicitly, she is kind of like, that's not his job, and I feel like he's also saying that's not my job. And I think that there's something really powerful about that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll take it a step further. I do believe it was a letter addressed to his son. I do believe that it has a wide audience and a readership, but it was so intimate how he talked to his son, and how I felt like if he was talking to anyone else, he was talking to other, like I felt like he was talking to me, although the letter was addressed to, right? Because those experiences he talked about are experiences that as a black person, as a black man in this country, there were so many things that I felt like, oh my God, like this is my experience, this is my.
At this time, please put your hands together for Ta-Nehisi Coates.
It's on now. No hot mic moments. So I'm incredibly excited to be sitting on stage with you. We first met a couple years ago when I invited you to a brown bag at ProPublica. And this was...
Prince Jones was the superlative of all my fears. And if he, good Christian, scion of a striving class, patron saint of the twice as good, could be forever bound, who then could not? And the plunder was not just of Prince Jones alone. Think of all the love poured into him. Think of the tuition for Montessori and music lessons. Think of the gasoline expended, the treads worn, carting him to football games, basketball tournaments, and Little League. Think of the time spent regulating sleepovers. Think of the surprise birthday parties, the daycare, the breakfast children, a kind of obsession. You are all we have, and you come to us in danger. I think we would like to kill you ourselves if we're seeing you killed by the streets that America made. That is a philosophy of the disembodied, of a people who control nothing, who can protect nothing, who are made to fear not just the criminals among them, but the police who lord over them with all the moral authority of a protection racket. It was only after you that I understood this love, that I understood the grip of my mother's hand.
I have to say, like, that passage took the air out of me when I read it. Like, I feel emotional just listening to it now, because I think I have a daughter, and this is what separates, even those of us who have managed to somehow climb into the black middle class. This is our separation, is that no matter what we've done, this can be the outcome for our children. But also,
Like your ability to protect the actual cat.
exactly, it's that doing everything that the country tells you to do will never be enough for our kids, and that's the difference.
To me, it means another thing we think about, like American exceptionalism. Yet another thing when you think about like Martin Luther King's dream, right? And so I want you to kind of talk about the way that he uses the dream and sort of the way that white people who believe that they are white, right, use the dream. What is the role of the dream in America? Sort of.
I think he set it up really nicely, like the way he sort of like packaged this discussion to his son, because he starts talking about the dream. And he talks about this idea, like, that is needed to sell a dream, and it's the idea that white people are white, right? Like that the majority of white people are white. And you have to sell this idea around the social construction of race in order for people to sort of believe that they are different from black people, right? So he kind of starts talking about that. But it's also from that point, because really, like, I think the basis of the book is around racism and white supremacy. So he talks about this idea of convincing people who move here from Europe that they are white and that they are sort of endowed with these differences that make them superior to other groups of people, notably black people, right? And so, in order for that that social construction to continue, you have to sell this idea. To sell a dream, you have to have people believe in that idea around about the biological sort of definition of race, right? And so it's on that social, what we know as socially constructed race, the dream perpetuates. So it can allow people to kind of live in this delusion of what America is, how it was constructed, how people got why people are in the places that they are in, why whites are in the position that they are in, while blacks are in the position they are in. It justifies our movement through the world, not only in the United States, it justifies our movement in other countries, colonialism, bombing countries like Iraq and going into Afghanistan. And you have to be sold on this illusion. So essentially, like, the dream is this idea that America is built on this illusion. And that in order for the illusion to continue, for people to really believe it, it's like a hologram. You can really, like, people can touch it and feel it because people are, like, benefiting from it, right? But you have to keep it going. Because if you don't keep it going, like, everything is going to, like, hit the fan, right? And so, the dreamers, like, they tell you, like, well, I've earned, like, he talked about it. Like, my parents came here and worked as hard as it, they worked hard for what they got, right? Like, they didn't get any handouts, goddammit. Like, they worked hard for what they, right? And in the dream, you're denying the reality. So you're denying that this country was based in, like, white supremacy and slavery, right? And this hierarchy that used black bodies as an economic powerhouse to make the most powerful country in the world. That's our historical legacy. You gotta believe in that dream. And so if any of you have read, and this is a book that will really help you, which one, do you guys teach Race and Ethnicity, or what is it called? Ethnic Groups. If you read Race is America by Joe Fagan, it'll just kind of like, it'll open your world up about white supremacy in the United States. And he doesn't use this word, like, he doesn't use this phrase white privilege, as I agree with Coates. He doesn't use white privilege to dance around the idea of white supremacy. Joe Fagan says white supremacy, and I would go further, he said white supremacy is central to the origins of this country. It's in every social institution that we engage in on a daily basis. So the dream, like, you have to, like, that's the premise of the dream, and we've continued to believe the dream. And I think he says that the dream is sort of like he almost alludes that it's for white folks, and you can sort of correct me, but I think other people are buying into the dream too. Like, the dreamers are not just white folks. Black people buy into the dream, Latinos, Asians, all, like, you have to live in this country. Because you know what, you can't, I'm standing up like I'm in church. Let me sit down. Let me sit down. Like, you can't honestly watch a young 16-year-old boy leave a store to go buy tea and candy, see him be followed by somebody who is not a police officer, be followed, told to refrain and stop, continue to follow that person, struggle with him in a fight and shoot him dead, right? Like, you have to believe that that's justified, you gotta believe in the dream. You have to, like, justify the dream. Because if you didn't, you would have to say, like, something about this is wrong.
Right.
Do you understand what I'm saying? So Did I explain what the dream is?
Yeah.
Go for it, C-Ray.
I think so, and I just want to like kind of contextualize it with this quote. Do you mind for a second, C-Ray? Because I think this is a really important quote. He says, "I am convinced that the dreamers, at least the dreamers of today, would rather live white than free. To awaken them is to reveal that they're an empire of men, and like all empires of men, they are built on the destruction of the body." And I think that's a really kind of key point of the dream. Did you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much to add to what Sheldon said. For me, every time I read the dream, I translated in my brain to like white supremacist ideology.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that it's true that when he says the dreamers, he's talking about white people. And I was just reading that section that you just quoted from earlier, and lots of parts of the book give me goosebumps, but that moment where he says, white people would rather live white than free is very powerful because he's constantly, when he refers to white people, he is constantly saying people who believe that they're white. And so he's like, it's really skillful the way that he is like constantly saying that race is socially constructed, like it's not real. But the whole book is about how it is real and it's lived, like its consequences are so real. So I feel like when he's saying white people would rather be white than free, it's like he's saying like white people are attached to their whiteness, even though his argument is that nothing good has ever come from whiteness. Like whiteness as a project, whiteness as a project is just like the history of slavery, right? The way, we were just reading the Michelle Alexander's book, the first chapter of her book, The New Jim Crow, in my class, and talking about how, like, it's not that white people were racist and so went to Africa, right? Like, the transatlantic slave trade was a capitalist project, but in the process, we get American race, and, like, white, he, in that part of the book, he's sort of saying, like, to his son, like, our struggle is one thing, which is, like, how to figure out how to traverse the world as black bodies, but, like, white people need to kind of figure out how to put down their whiteness, and when he says put down their whiteness, like, I'm thinking about whiteness as, like, a weapon, So, that's all that I would kind of add.
That's powerful.
I want to sort of move on to one of the other major themes of the book, fear. Fear among people of color, Black people in America, fear for Black bodies, Black children, Black teenagers, fear of those who are supposed to protect you, which really stems from sort of not having full freedom, right, or control of your body. And so one of the quotes that stuck with me, and I sent it to you all, in those moments he says, "Your neurology was always on code red. We were divided, one foot in America, the other in a land of swords. We were told to act civilized, but everywhere bordered on carnage." And so I wonder, he talks about this sort of overwhelming fear, but he doesn't really give any, and I don't know that he's intending to, advice on how to kind of manage this fear. What are the effects, the consequences of this fear, the effect of this fear consuming our mental and emotional space? Is it possible, to what extent can we turn fear into like a mobilizing force? Can you pull power from fear?
Okay, so as I was reading this, and then I thought about your question, and I was like, damn, because I was thinking about this on a very personal level. I was thinking about it as a scholar. It's like, as I approach this reading or this book, I'm looking at it on so many different levels. I'm approaching it as a scholar and sociologist. I'm approaching it as a Black man. I'm also approaching it as somebody who, grew up in Baltimore. His trajectory, his travels are very similar to mine. I grew up in Baltimore, as I said, moved to New York and lived in New York. I'm a New Yorker, which he talks about in the book. I went to Howard, I went to the Mecca, so for the same reasons why he talks about going to Howard to capture something, I went to Howard for the same reasons, right? I went to Howard for my PhD, and I went to Howard because I went to PWIs, predominantly white institutions, for undergrad and graduate school. And in undergrad and in graduate school, I had professors who were trained at Howard. And those were the sociologists the professors who invested time in me, and they weren't the only ones, clearly, right? But they invested in a special way, like only black folks can invest in, right? Older black folks invest in black folks, right? So they were like, you know, I'd go out on the weekend, I'd be with my fraternity brothers, and they'd be like, you know better than that. You know, right? Like a communal kind of way, right? And so, so we have a very kind of similar path. And so the fear he talks about, I think, is very similar in me as well, right? So he talks about this idea of growing up and not being of any one particular world. So he wasn't like, he had to be in the streets, but he wasn't of the streets, right? So because you growing up in Baltimore, like you had to fight. Like, and so many of the things he said in the book, it made me laugh. Like, you had to fight, you had to but you couldn't be too violent. Because being too violent will get you arrested, right? And at the same time, your parents had to teach you to fight and teach you to protect yourself to to sort of survive on the streets. And at the same time, there was a fear, this fear, even though you may not have been too violent, right? You couldn't be too bookish either because there was a fear, right? So all parts of our lives, right? There's this fear that you walk around, right? And even when he talked about how, if anybody wants to understand how black parents parent, you should read his book. Because he talks about this fear in their parenting. And this fear that they instill in you. Right? And he talks about, I think he said it in the talk, so this is the fear, fear from all, that we, that I carry, that resonated with me because I carry that fear. Fear of the streets, fear of of the police, fear of your neighborhoods. So that's a lot to grapple with. I think the answer or the solution to your question, I didn't mean to take such a long time, is that struggle. It's learning how to negotiate that and balance it, and it's a hard thing. And how do you reconcile it? For me, the reconciliation came from learning about the world and learning how to sort of debunk the dream and a level of awareness and consciousness. That's where it came from for me, right? Learning how to talk to people in the streets and be in the classroom and sort of learning how to be in different places in different spaces. Right? Unlike him, I think for me, it was I was exposed, I saw different worlds, right? He talks about in between two worlds. I had that experience at a fairly early age, so it was even though I grew up in a poor neighborhood in Baltimore, I knew that wasn't the only thing that existed. And I had family members and stuff that ground me in that. So that fear didn't carry me. I also think I'm slightly, there was a slight, we're in the same generation, but I grew up in the church, so there was hope. I thought about, he says this, and when I think about it, it gives me pimples too. I think about all the love that was poured into me. He talked about that, right? And I was very mindful of that as a first generation American. I thought about how much my mother sacrificed for me. So that fear was also a fear of and I talked about it just with some of my students in my class today, for some of my students who are here. I talked about the fear of letting her down. I talked about the fear of letting my community down. There was this onus that, and I'm talking from a very personal place, you know what I mean? Which is different, right? As I wear these different caps. And so I think that's what allowed me to navigate the fear. I don't think it completely ever really goes away. My 40th birthday, and one of my neighbors is here. The police pulled me out of, stop and frisk me at the Pathmark in my neighborhood on my 40th birthday. So,
Wow.
Does that answer your question? It exists because you can't ignore it, because if you ignore it, you're going to be dreaming. It's a dream. You're giving into the dream. This is the reality, right?
Okay, so I prepared, I wrote some comments down about this question that I'm going to do a little bit of reading. I think just for Sheldon, so much of his comments are coming from the perspective of living as a black man. I think my whiteness and what I think this book means for a white person who is interested in anti-racism is kind of, so we'll see. So, and I think I sort of start by talking about like this question of hope first, because the end of your question is like, what can we do with this fear?
Yeah.
Like how can we turn it into something better or something, or mobilized or useful or whatever. So I kind of start there and then talk more about the fear. Okay, so I think that for my own reading at least, I want to like put a moment of caution or pause between my reading of the text and my desire to feel hopeful about social change or social justice or racial equality. Because I think that the text asks us to sit with the pain of the present and the terror of the history that has structured the present. The pain of the present being for Coates, the reality of Black death in America, the disposability of Black bodies, the abject white hate of Black bodies, and the carnage it has wrought. So there's who we already mentioned, there's a Black sociology professor at Virginia Commonwealth University named Tressie McMillan Cottom, who has written extensively on issues of race in the United States, and she wrote a series of 3 essays in the Atlantic on Coates' book, which I recommend. And in her 3rd essay, she talks about how she had gotten so much reader feedback on her first 2 essays, and that she said that many white readers sort of lamented the lack of hope in the text, and that many Black readers lamented the lack of religion. And she goes on to write about the atheism of the text, which was something that really resonated with me. But in the part where she's talking about how white readers want to find more hope in the text, she says, and I'm quoting, "Some readers have focused on the hopelessness in the text, both bemoaning it and celebrating it, like boot camp survivors. I attribute this to 2 things. For some white readers, nothing short of Black people wrapped in the American flag serving apple pie to soldiers at a country music festival on plates commemorating our liberation from the dark continent would qualify as hopeful enough. Coates could never have rendered the hope those readers find wanting in Between the World and Me, because they don't really seek hope, but rather crave an absolution. They need priests, and Coates is a writer." So I like that analysis, and I think that as a white American in particular, I don't want to rush towards hope. I want to pause with the terror and the fear and the carnage and the grief. I think that this text is a gift, and I think that part of the value of it is having to sit with what he has given us here and what he has given his son. I think it's also important to think about the different roles that hope might play for Black and for white readers. For Black readers, hope might operate to make this hostile world more livable. But I worry too that hope might do the same thing for white readers, and I don't want the world to be more livable for white readers. And I don't know that Coates does either. I think Coates is telling us that hope has left whites catatonic in the face of the carnage of the death of Black bodies. I don't want to say that it's going to be okay, because I think that one of the contributions of the text is to say, fuck the future, the present is absolutely unlivable, literally unlivable, livable in the sense that it's deadly. And I think that we have to face that in its starkest darkness, and we have to reckon with it. So the question of hope, though, begs the next question, which is how? How do we change this country? And I think that it's an important question. And in some ways the answer is so simple. White people need to stop murdering Black people. It's not more complicated than that. There are ways to make it seem very complicated, and as a sociologist I've been trained to do so. We could talk about all the necessary policy changes and cultural changes and possible directions for social movements. But Coates hasn't written a book about those things. He's not a sociologist. He's a Black man living in a Black body in America, and he's afraid. And I think he has every reason to be afraid, and we have been summoned to witness that fear. I think that he doesn't allow the fear to overtake him because he has been made in its context. It's not novel for him like it is for a white reader. I don't have to live in that fear. I don't have to traverse it in my everyday life. I have the luxury of sitting here, being in awe of it. To use an analogy we often learn, perhaps from personal experience, perhaps in our psychology classes, that abused children aren't often able to understand that they were abused until adulthood, when they are exposed to people who haven't been abused. With that comparison, they see that as children they had been abused. I feel like Coates is not overtaken by his fear because he has never had the privilege of feeling anything different. He can see that the dreamers or white people don't have to feel the fear, but he's never had the privilege of being fearless. That's one of his points about the nature of being Black in America. And to the last part of the question, I don't think I want to say anything about how we can use fear or turn fear into a mobilizing force, or how we can pull power from fear. I think those are good questions, but I'm not going to sit here as a white person and tell black people how to manage their fear or mobilize their fear in white supremacist America.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Like, the fear is real. It is real. I could walk out on the street right now and get gunned down. Like, for real. That is real. And there's no way for you to kind of sort of dance around it. You got to deal with it, right? And that's what you're essentially saying. And Coach said it himself, I think, right? In some ways during the panel discussion or the discussion.
So then within this sphere, he does talk about like the struggle, right, in the book. And there's just a short quote. It says, struggle for the memory of your ancestors, struggle for wisdom. And I like this part. He says, but do not struggle for the dreamers. Do not pin your struggle on their conversion. The dreamers will have to learn to struggle for themselves. So essentially he's arguing that struggle is important whether success is ensured or not, right?
Yeah.
And it's worth trying even if you're not sure. So what does he mean, or what is sort of your rendering of what he means by this struggle? How do we play a meaningful role in the struggle? How are we engaged in meaningful struggle?
Okay, I struggle with this point to this point. I tried to, I thought about it, and because I didn't read the text, I listened to it, I was like, okay, I really needed to see the text in this instance. But what I believe that the struggle that he's talking about is a struggle to question, to challenge the existing, the way our society, American society, is constructed, and how, and you have to sort of challenge it and question it, and don't just live in it. Don't accept it as like what it is in this moment. But to keep going, right? Like that part where he talks about, struggle for your ancestors. It's like your ancestors didn't pour all this love into you for you to give in, right? Or to submit to the dreamers, or submit to white supremacy, right? It's your job to navigate it and to deal with it and to question it and to interrogate it. That's what he was saying to his son. Don't throw your hands up. And in that, to me, is where the hope lies.
Yeah.
Like the hope lies in the best way to deal with America, United States, is to see the United States for what it is. And oftentimes when I'm teaching my students, when we go through sociology, and there are some particular sort of areas that we talk about, and it feels so hopeless to them. When we talk about class inequality, and we talk about racial inequality, and all of various forms of oppressions or whatever, and social stratification, some students really struggle with that. It's painful for them. And why is it painful? Because they see the reality of what we've been taught to be mindful of what this world is, what it has for you, to figure it out, to question it, to challenge it, to try to change it, but not to sort of give into it, not to bow down to it, not to let it break you. And that's an important thing, I think, to tell a black man, especially today, a young black man, because there are forces at work to break them, to break us. And you need to be mindful of it. And I think that's what he's trying to bring to the attention of, you need to be mindful of your history. There's an urgency to knowing your history and knowing where you come from. And I think that's what he's talking about with the struggle.
Okay, I'm going to do some more reading. So, I think that for Coates, the struggle is the project of living in a black body in a racist country that is dominated and run by the dreamers who may at any moment take your black life. With the quote about how the dreamers must learn to struggle for themselves, I think throughout the book when he says the phrase, people who believe themselves white, I was so impacted by that phrase. It's skillful, right, as I was saying. that he's constantly evoking the social construction of race while at the same time providing an arresting meditation on its realness and its consequences. I think that he's asking white people, or actually I don't think that he's addressing white readers at all, which is part of the power of the text, but I think that he's saying that white people need to realize the social construction of race and to put down the weapon of their whiteness. And that's not and that it's not black folks' job to help them figure out how to do that. He thinks that white people need to realize that whiteness has never been and will never be good. Whiteness is a category that develops through a process of enslavement, imprisonment, and murder. So when you asked, how do we play a meaningful role in the struggle, I thought of a passage at the end of the autobiography of Malcolm X where he's talking about his involvement in black nationalism, and he says that these well-meaning white people keep coming up to him at the end of talks and meetings and saying to him, like, I want to join black nationalism, I want to be a part of black power, how can I help and what can I do? And Malcolm X reads that, and I think quotes would have a similar analysis as white people wanting to somehow absolve themselves of their guilt and their complicity in white supremacy by being somehow close to black people. And Malcolm X sort of says to white people, go back to your homes and to your families and to your neighborhoods and to your communities where the racism grows. And I remember that I read that for the first time in college, and it really had an impact on me because I came from a white family where people used the N-word and people were racist. And even as I was developing an anti-racist consciousness in politics, I still wouldn't speak up in those moments. I didn't want to have those fights with my father or my brothers. I wanted to keep the peace. And I think that one of the things that I learned in that passage in Malcolm X's autobiography is that I have to have those fights. That it's my duty and my responsibility to have those fights as a white person. I need to be engaged with other white people about whiteness and racism and white supremacy. It's not enough to have black friends. It actually has nothing to do with having black friends at all. It's about confronting white supremacy in myself and on all of the white people in my life. So I think that for me, that's how I can be engaged in the struggle.
And I just want to kind of read one more passage, a little bit more about where I see sort of some hope coming from him, and about sort of depending on the dreamers. He says, to awaken the dreamers, to rouse them of the fact of their need to be white, their need to talk like they are white, their need to think like they are white, what it is that the dream has done, and all the design flaws it has exposed of humanity, and what it has done to the world. And so he's talking to his son here, he says, but you cannot arrange your life around that, right? And so you cannot arrange your life around the chance that the dreamers will come into consciousness. Our moment, our time here is just too brief, our bodies are too precious, and you are here now, and you must live, and there is so much out here for you to live for. Not in someone else's country, but your own home. The warmth of our particular world is beautiful, no matter how brief and how breakable. And he kind of says, how do I live free in this black body? And he says to his son, this is your country, this is your world, this is your body, and you must find a way to live within all of it. Right? And so it seems like he gives some sort of, again, kind of hope, right? How do we hold on to ourselves, like within the struggle, amidst this sort of dream?
Well, I think he does see the hope in his son. Like, he sees a departure from where, like, his experiences, even the part where he's talking about, you know, like the sort of dogs sort of nipping at your heels or whatever. He knows that the world that his son experiences, even though his son is experiencing or starting to experience it in the same ways, he knows that it's different. Right? He says, like, I've never grown up with a black president before. Like, I don't know what that experience is like. Like, yeah. You have been to places, I have taken you to places, I've had you experience things that I had never experienced as a young person. And so I think in Ta-Nehisi himself, you know, between these two worlds, it's his exposure to the world. It's his exposure to, like, Howard, it's his travels to Paris or whatever that gave him hope that there is another way of being, right? Like, that there is a place that is there, and I don't think he was suggesting that, like, Paris or other places are like are anti-racist, they don't have racism or whatever. But he did see through his travels, I think, that there was a different way of being as, like, a black person or a black man, and so I think there was hope in that. I think he gives hope. I think he writes this letter as, like, a declaration of hope for his son, like how to navigate this racist world, and I think that's hopeful. He doesn't give into it. He doesn't tell them to try to change white people's minds. He wants them to be mindful of like, you know, what he's gonna have to deal with. And making his life better for himself. And so I think there's hope in that. Like there's nothing more hopeful than like your child, right?
I'm just noticing that it's after 8.
If you have like a brief response, and that was kind of our last question, so we can kind of.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I don't have tons to say, and I didn't write a response to this question because I was sort of like, I don't feel good about telling Black people how they should feel hopeful. That feels weird. But I think that when you were just talking now, I was remembering how in the book, like, Howard University for him is the Mecca, right? And it's like this sanctuary away from the dream and the dreamers being sort of white people and white supremacy. Sheldon went to Howard. So I think that, I think that there's a sense in the book that part of what is so terrifying about the possibility of having your life taken at any moment is that life is really like wonderful and beautiful, and like that, you know, he wants his son to experience knowledge and learning and like discovering and growing and all these wonderful things. And so I think, you know, the hope, I suppose, is that this is a possibility, right? Like, to live.
Because the dreamers are living that way. So
Yeah.
right, like, and he talks about it. He's like, there are apple pies and white picket fences, and like, so it exists, right? So there's a potential or possibility that that you can acquire or have those things, but not taking the full sort of dosage of what the dreamers take, right?
Like, you still have to be afraid.
Yeah.
Like, the dreamers you can have the same shit, but
Still be afraid.
yeah.
Right.
Right.
It's a great book.
Read it if you haven't.
Yeah.
And thank you to Professor Applewhite for support, for their comments.
Thanks for coming. It's great to see you guys. This is like the first sociology event.
It is. Well, it's fun, yeah. Yeah, it is. And so the Sociology Club, again, meets most Wednesdays in Bitterman 207. So come on out and join us. Read the book. If you didn't sign in here, please do.
And join the Sociology Club if you want to be a member of the Sociology Club.
Yes.
And we also have a new major, the Sociology major.
Yes.
If you're interested in it, so get at it. Okay?